Hey, didn't see you there. Did you know that in space, teleportation might be possible? Kind of like this. See what I mean? Anyway, let's read a book about space. So we're gonna read a book called Astronauts Exploring Space. You're gonna see it on your screen there, so don't worry, you'll be able to see everything I'm reading, okay? All right, let's get started. So, if you're on page number 1, you'll see that astronauts are people who fly space shuttles or work in space. So, as you can see in the picture, there's a person there who's dressed in this big suit, and it's this huge bulky white suit with a big huge helmet and a big backpack. And so that, if you've seen them before in the movies, they're always in space, right? Those are astronauts. Those people are the ones who go up in the spaceship and they fly to the space shuttle. They fly to the space station, and they basically are there for a time, and they're able to see things that are going on all over the planet from there. And they're able to control satellites, which is what gives us our TV and our internet and the radio and anything that you watch on YouTube or any website is all being streamed from a satellite in space. And those astronauts are the ones that are in control of that. Some astronauts have gone to the moon, and they are planning to send some to other planets as well. So the word astronaut means star sailor. So it's pretty cool because that's exactly what they do, right? They're in the stars, they're in space, and they're traveling through and trying to find new discoveries every single day. All right, let's go on to the next page. The people who become astronauts work in many different jobs. Some are in the military, some are scientists, some are engineers, some are doctors, and some are even teachers, right? So it's very possible for anyone, in a sense, to become an astronaut, right? There's a certain process you would have to go through, which is probably pretty hard and probably something that isn't, easily done. But at the end of the day, as you can see in the picture, there are many types of people who become astronauts. So it's not only people who studied science, but rather people who actually just have a very strong passion for space, right? And these people have been able to make different discoveries in their own specific jobs, right? So as you can see, like it said scientists, engineers, doctors, or even teachers, right? So doctors might be able to find a new way to treat those people who are in space, right? Because space is a lot different than being here on Earth. So that being the case, they need to find a different way to be able to, if one of them gets hurt, to be able to fix their problem and their pain, right? Engineers are people who build things or who are in charge of designing the structure of something. And so they definitely need to know how things work in space, because in space, engineers are also needed, right? Teachers, right? People who learn more about space can teach others about space, and so that everybody can be informed in the same manner. Okay. All right. So let's go on to the next page. There are different kinds of astronauts. Some astronauts are pilots. They fly space shuttles, right? So the ones who actually fly the space shuttle up to space is someone who is already a pilot, but they've learned to pilot a space shuttle now, which is, I'm sure, a million times harder than it is to fly a plane, but don't quote me on that, okay? Because I don't want any pilots getting mad at me. So all I know is that it is very hard, and these people who are very passionate about space have learned to fly this space shuttle so that they could go right up into space and explore themselves. Okay, let's go to the next page. Pilots can also be commanders. A commander is in charge of a space shuttle and makes sure everyone on board is safe, right? So this is kind of like, if you know what an air marshal is on an airplane, they're the ones who are kind of in disguise, and you don't really know who they are, but they're in charge of taking down any bad guys that are on the plane or solving any issues that are on a plane, right? And they just make sure everybody's safe. So a commander in space is is what is an air marshal, but for on a space shuttle. Okay, so they're the ones who take care of every single person, make sure everybody is safe. Okay, let's go to the next page. Some astronauts are mission specialists. They make sure that the space shuttle system works correctly. So they're basically the ones who are making sure everyone's safe, but in a different sense. So the commander makes sure everyone's safe on board and is like a person-to-person basis. But this guy, or girl, the mission specialist, is in charge of making sure that the actual spacecraft is intact. That means that they have to make sure that it's not broken, that they have to make sure that all the wires are connected properly, and that everything is just running very smoothly with the actual spacecraft itself. All right, let's go to the next page. Payload specialists are also members of space shuttle crews. They are not trained as astronauts. Their job is to work on experiments. So these people are not the ones who step off the spacecraft. These people are just in the lab doing experiments, right? So every day we have new discoveries, and they're the ones who are usually making them because they're doing the experiments and coming up with hypotheses. If you don't know what that means, a hypothesis is basically an educated guess or a scientific guess to see if we can obtain or get to a certain goal, right? So they're the ones doing all these experiments and coming up with all the problem solutions, right? All right, next page. Astronauts train at the Johnson Space Center in Texas. They take science classes and study how space shuttles work. They often practice using tools and machines. So there's a place in Texas where all of the astronauts go to train at some point in their training. It's called Johnson Space Center. I know some of you guys may know that in Orlando we have Kennedy Space Center, but like the main facility would be here in Texas, in the Johnson Space Center. Okay, so like we said, they take classes, daily classes, right, on science and everything that they would need to know in order to travel into space. They also practice with the tools and machines. I don't know if you've ever seen like space movies before, but before they always go into space, you always see this training where they're in like a little pod connected to a giant column, and it just spins in circles really, really fast, and it's supposed to simulate or make you feel like you're inside of a space shuttle blasting off into space. So that's what they practice when they go to this space center. Okay, let's move on to the next page. Underwater training. So sometimes they train underwater to make them feel like they're in space. So when you're in space, I'm sure if you've seen space movies before or any videos from space, you've seen that the astronauts are floating around, right? They're not standing on the floor. That's because there's no gravity in space. Gravity is what makes us stand on the ground and what makes everything around us stay on the floor when we're on Earth, right? Gravity doesn't exist in space. In space, there's no gravity, so that's why everybody floats around. That being the case, they tend to train underwater so that they're experiencing this kind of like zero gravity and floating around everywhere. And that way, when they get to space, they're already used to it, all right? Okay, next page. Astronauts learn how to survive a crash landing on Earth. They practice using parachutes and swimming in flight suits. Okay, so this is very, very scary, I'm sure, but they have to be prepared for every situation. So they learn how to survive a shuttle crash, right? So if they were ever to crash, whether on Earth or in space or whatever, they have the training done for that. And what they do is they basically crash land on purpose, but not necessarily. They just like jump out before anything happens, and they have to use their parachutes, and they have to have all of their suit and gear on, and they usually land in the water to make it again more like realistic. But they practice this stuff, and it's pretty dangerous. We have to give them credit for that. But anyway, let's move on to the next page. Astronauts train for about 3 years, then they're ready to blast off into space. So all of these trainings actually take place within 3 years, like they said. So I don't know if it's divided year by year by year, but at the end of the day, they learn everything that they need to know in order to travel into space in only 3 years. Most big practices or jobs that you would find on Earth, like a doctor or a lawyer, those jobs take for a very long time in order to master. I know that some surgeons are actually required to study for about 12 years in order to finally master their technique and their occupation or job, right? But 3 years, only 3 years is what it takes for these astronauts to be able to know everything they need to know about space travel, or not everything, but enough to get up there, right? And from there on out, it's hands-on learning, right? So that's pretty crazy. All right, let's move on to the next page. There is little gravity in space. Astronauts are weightless. They float from place to place inside the shuttle, right? So like we said, there's no gravity in space. And so they're constantly floating around everywhere, even in the space shuttle. And so things are a lot different when you're in space. I'm sure they might get into it later. But even the height of your own body is shrunken in space. I don't know if you knew that. So let's move on to the next page. Astronauts strap themselves onto special beds or into sleeping bags in order to sleep. So because of the fact that there is no gravity, they also need to strap themselves down to a wall or to the floor in order to sleep, because if not, their bodies would float into walls while they were sleeping and it would keep waking them up. So that's what they need to do in order to sleep. Let's go on to the next page. Astronauts must be careful when they eat. Their food can float away, right? Again, no gravity. So whenever they eat food, they have to really make sure they're holding on tight, because if not, their food will float off and they will have to chase it. Or, hopefully they're not eating outside, which is not really possible. But if they were, it would float off all the way into space and never be found again. So they really have to be careful with that one. All right, let's move on to the next page. Astronauts have a mission every time they travel to space. They sometimes bring supplies to a space station where other astronauts live and work. Basically, every time a space, any astronaut, right, whether it's a commander or just a regular astronaut, whenever they go into space, they always have a mission. And like this page said, sometimes it's to deliver supplies, other times it's probably to deliver information. Maybe they're bringing someone up who needs to fix a certain problem. Maybe an engineer is flying up and he needs to fix an issue on the space station, right? There are different people who are required for different jobs. So whenever they're needed, they basically just fly up and perform the job correctly. Okay, let's move on to the next page. Astronauts may bring a satellite in the space shuttle. The pilot uses a robot arm to pull the satellite into orbit. So one of these missions could literally be to bring an entire satellite up into space, like a new one, or just to put it into orbit. So orbit is basically just the word that talks about how the Earth is spinning and we're kind of and they're spinning around it, right? So in space, everything that's kind of close to Earth will if it's not going to be pulled directly into the Earth, will just be spinning around the Earth, okay? So all of these satellites and the space stations, they're all up there, but they're not in one place. They're spinning around the Earth because of the Earth's gravitational pull, okay? Let's move on to the next page. We're almost done, guys. So, mission specialists might make a spacewalk to fix a part of the space station. They wear special suits, right? So astronaut suits to which they travel up to space in are different than the ones that they would use to leave the spacecraft. So a spacewalk is basically just like a mission where they are attaching themselves to the ship or the spacecraft of any kind, and they basically walk over to the part that they need to fix. So if my phone here is the spaceship and the person's about this big, they'll probably come out, they're connected to the actual spaceship, and they're gonna come all the way over here to fix this part, right? But they're actually, this is all just space, so they're actually in space at that point. So that's why they need to wear special suits, right? Okay. All right, let's move on to the next page. So it says, the astronauts are ready to go home. The pilot fires the engine and steers the space shuttle back to Earth. So when they're ready to go, all they do is basically they're all, preparing to go, and then they make the announcement, and then the pilot will start the engines and will steer the shuttle back to Earth, right? And so a space shuttle will land in a similar way than that of a plane, right? So if you ever seen a plane land before, kind of like eases in, right? A space shuttle will do something similar to that, except when it's descending to the Earth, it's usually very, very fast and very, I'm sure, nerve-wracking for the ones on board. It's not as, even though sometimes planes can be kind of scary, but it's not as calm as you would say as a plane ride would be. This is probably a lot more intense, right? Because when you come in to the Earth's atmosphere, you have to break a few barriers, and in order to do that, you have to be going at a certain speed, right? And so when they're coming down, it's super fast, and it's not anywhere near the speed that a plane is going. In fact, 17,500 miles per hour is the speed at which they enter the Earth. So that is a lot faster than a plane is, okay? So this is definitely something that is more intense, a lot more intense, okay? All right, let's move on to the next page. The astronauts shut down the space shuttle controls. They are ready to leave the space shuttle. Mission completed. Okay, so at the end of everything, they land, they're safe and sound, they shut down the space shuttle control, and they turn off all the engines, and they walk out, and they say, mission accomplished, right? So they did what they needed to do, and now they're back on Earth, safe and sound. So, with that being said, guys, I want you guys to take this little quiz that comes with the book. Basically, it's 6 questions just asking you about we talked about today and what you might have learned, okay? So with that being said, guys, I will see you guys in the next video, and I hope you enjoy Space Week.